this is an important situation, maybe he is obliged to take action. So from social engineering, it becomes relatively easy to take access within the environment, not always using sophisticated technology. Because we have permanent IP addresses on the internet, it becomes easy to footprint them or find their presence. Once hackers find their presence, it's very easy to create what we call a denial of service condition. Let's assume one of you have got an email out on the internet, an email server. A hacker, the only thing he really needs to do is to bombard that email server with lots of requests. Two things are going to happen. You do not have enough bandwidth to respond to all the attacks, and your email server will stop responding, or the email server may run out of storage because you do not have enough capacity to store all the incoming mails. Other aspects, scanning, it allows you to identify the services running within the environment. Once you know what is running behind the infrastructure, it becomes much easier to attack that infrastructure. Typically, organizations, when they install software, they tend to install them with default user IDs and passwords. We have somebody here from Oracle. Many of you probably have used Oracle. When you install Oracle for the first time, typically there is a training database that gets installed along with the system. What happens in a lot of cases is most of the users forget to remove this training database. If you look at the manuals on the internet, you quickly realize that the user ID is called Scott and the password is called Tiger. Of course, you're logging into a training database, not necessarily a production system. But once you're already in, you have achieved half the battle. You already have a foot into the door. Not always a powerful foot, but at least an entry point. The idea is not just to get into the door, but get into the door with lots of capabilities and lots of power. So we call this escalation of privilege, being able to get what we sometimes refer to as the super user. Now, during these 2 to 4 days, you'll have a chance to see not only what is capable of doing when you do an escalation of privilege, but actually how to prevent this from happening. Today, there's technologies that create sandboxes within the operating system that prevent these kind of events from taking place. That means you're trying to control what is capable of doing at the process level within the operating system. Typically, once you have what we call super user capabilities, you can do pretty much anything within the environment. You can delete or remove files. You can delete log files so that people do not know you were there in the first place. We typically call this anti-forensic type of tools or capabilities. But you may not launch the attack immediately, so you may leave a backdoor to come in at a later time. When we scan systems around the Middle East, we typically find 25 to 50% of the machines actually have some kind of backdoor built into them. These backdoors may have been left around by previous hackers or software that was installed previously on the machine. So one of the important aspects about being able to defend yourselves is what we call understanding the enemy. What are the capabilities, how they attack your infrastructure, and then take the necessary measures. There's a few websites, and especially there's a very famous project called the Oninet project, which gives you a lot of information about how to achieve that. Now, it looks all very complicated and all very complex. How do we start? One of the first things we need to understand is what we call the assets. You need to have a good understanding what are the information assets, what is the hardware, software, and network that is running within your own infrastructure. Many times we visit an organization and we ask, well, what are the machines and do you have? Oh, I have Windows, we have a mainframe. Then we start looking and says, well, there's this Unix machine here or Linux. Oh, it's still there, we forgot, it's in the conversion process. If you do not understand the infrastructure that you have, how can you protect? So one of the first elements is have a good, thorough understanding of the infrastructure. From there, you can understand what are the exposures, vulnerabilities, and threats. And from there, you can choose or select the appropriate control mechanisms. Sometimes not everything is easily defendable. Let's take a simple example. Some organizations today are running technologies like AS400. AS400, although very powerful and very secure machine in most of the cases, has some serious limitations depending on how it gets used. For example, if you enable services like, for example, Telenet on an AS400, you're actually enabling lots of potential trouble. Why? There's two limitations very basic to the AS400 environment. One is the user ID and the password is limited to 8 characters. Not only is limited to 8 characters, it's limited to uppercase characters and numbers. Now, what this really is telling you is that the attack space of all permutations is now much smaller than we expect. What it really means is you can take a computer and program it to do what we typically call in security brute force. Brute force means trying all possible permutations. And today, when you try all these possible permutations, you're able to break machines that a few years ago would have been relatively difficult to break. But at the end of the day, you have to make difficult decisions. And the difficult decisions go along these lines. You can be secure, you can be cheap, or you can be in a hurry. But you cannot do all of these at the same time. Most organizations have got limitations. You have systems to put in production by certain deadlines or certain dates. Maybe you don't have the appropriate budget. And anytime you're trying to implement a fully secure solution, there are some serious compromises that need to be taken in place. This is a screenshot of somebody that was on their home, and this is the message that was on their screen. They actually happened to have a webcam on their machine, so somebody was remotely watching what they were doing within the room. Why? Because they had an ADSL within their desktop, so somebody took over the machine, and without knowing, they were spying on them. As you can see, when we look at security today, we have to look at all the aspects, and we always should be ready for what we sometimes call the unexpected. You're never going to know what is the new type of attack or where is it going to come from. Even what we call sometimes security companies are not immune. But if you're going to hack a security company, you have to do it in a very eloquent way, and you have to at least make it interesting, so that this is a case of Sense.org, one of the most famous security companies. This is an example of a second one, RSA. RSA actually got attacked several times. One time they even lost their IP address and website for some time. But those are things that we can discuss at a later time. This is an example from a government or a library website in the Library of Congress in the United States. When we look at security, typically the things that get us is not the big things, because we know how to have the firewalls, intrusion detection systems. We can put things in strong encryption, but we typically tend to forget the small little window that we leave open. And the little window can come from failures, typically in end users, or typically in elements of process. And we'll get to that in a second. So when we're looking at security, we always need to look at 3 primary elements: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Most of the security standards cover this in a highly structured manner. I would like to make at least a basic observation about these 3 letters, easy to remember, CIA. Integrity and availability you can restore. It means if you have a backup or you have another processing mechanism, you can bring it back alive. Confidentiality, when it gets breached, you cannot get it back. Let me give you a simple example. There's a company called Eli Lilly, which is actually the manufacturers of a famous drug called Prozac. As you know, Prozac is one of these new generation of drugs that in a highly stressful world, it's supposed to make you relax. Now, Eli Lilly actually exposed a lot of their customers when they did a specific mailing within their own environment. Confidentiality has been breached, so it embarrasses the organization, and then you cannot really take it back once it has been done. Another important aspect to measure is the source of the potential threats. And the potential threats are not just hackers. They come from many aspects. Things like power outage, things like storms, floods, hardware error, bombs, hurricanes, etc. If you actually look at the statistics out there, and you look at some things that happen in Bahrain, I think we have probably well within the statistic ranges. We have had storms, we've had power outages, maybe the occasional flood from time to time. And I've seen a few people, I think here from Kuwait as well. Kuwait or Riyadh does get the occasional flood, especially during the January, February timeframes. So how do we go about having an infrastructure that helps give agility to the organization when it comes to defend themselves appropriately for security. There's